Welcome to the Does It Work podcast by Biomarker Labs, where you can find wellness without the woo.
There's an alligator coming down.
What's up? Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. I am today joined by Lindsay McLeary. He is a photojournalist, a writer, author, speaker, editor, all-around amazing guy. And today we're going to talk about some pretty heavy stuff that I think you'll find pretty interesting and potentially useful. So, Lindsay, thanks so much for coming on. We met on Tinder a year and a half ago.
Yeah, it might actually be longer than that.
Yeah,
a couple years ago, I think.
Yeah. And this is like a pretty common way for you to make connections that are lasting, which is unusual for the Tinder sphere.
Yeah, well, I think what you do is you go at it, just imagining that you're going to be somebody's friend, and then everything else follows there. I actually have more friends that I've met via Tinder than I have probably partners that I've met via Tinder, but yeah.
That's amazing. I love it. Yeah. It's been wonderful to know you for this. I met you like right after I moved to SF. And so you're like one of my first friends.
Yeah, still living in the Noe Valley, as I recall.
Yeah. Noe. Okay. So today I wanted to speak to you about your history regarding opiate addiction. This is something that you told me, you're pretty open about, and I really respect and admire that. I really appreciate that. And some of the things that you've learned about how to manage your recovery, and maybe how that can apply to people who are also in recovery, or maybe just like kind of applicable life skills. I know I am somewhat familiar with some of the recovery, 12-step recovery stuff. And a lot of it is just very useful life advice that anyone really could benefit from. But yeah, the other thing that I really like about your story, and we'll get into it, is that I feel like a lot of people have this image of what an addict looks like, or an addict comes from, how they first start using. And in my experience, addiction can start with anyone. It can start anywhere. It can be, you are an engineer for you're a contractor, you've got a security clearance, you can start using meth, you can be, in your case, a tenure track or a PhD candidate, starting to use opiates. Like it's cuts across job titles, race lines, class lines, everything. But anyway, yeah. So,
the thing is that I was a graduate student at Stanford, and I was an Oxycontin and other opiate addict. I actually managed to get, I was getting morphine from across the border from crooked doctors in Tijuana. But at the same time that I was an opiate addict and a graduate student at Stanford, I was also a straight A student. So I was on my way to getting a PhD at the same time as being an opiate addict. I actually had to drop out of graduate school after I quit because I couldn't handle the stress without the use of drugs. I was I don't know if that's the typical path for an opiate addict. Definitely for those who are doing like pharmaceutical grade, pharmaceutical opiates. But one of the people who actually I had a connection with when I was an addict was actually a math graduate student, math PhD student. That's who I was buying my Oxycontin from, was a math graduate student at Berkeley. And so you kind of see this strange correspondence sometimes with very, very high achieving intellectuals and academics, and either drug or alcohol addiction, right? And I'm going to call it not alcoholism, but alcohol addiction, right? So that's one of the things, at least that's who I had exposure to. At the same time, I was mixing with people who were buying drugs in the Mission. So that would be, balloons, right? Balloons that you would see, little balloons of heroin that you would actually could buy in the Mission at this time. I don't know if you can still buy them in the Mission because the Mission's become a different place. This was about 10 or 12 years ago. So there's a very interesting wide spectrum of drug addicts, especially here in the Bay Area.
And I think it's important for people to realize this, if nothing else, because I think a lot of people say, you know, my son is a straight A student in grad school, like he would never be in this position. Like this would never happen to our family. Like this would never happen to me. And the reality is quite the opposite, that it can happen to anyone at any time. And so when you're thinking about how do we deal with this problem, and you're considering a more punitive versus rehabilitative approach, like knowing that, you know, we are all in this together and this could happen to anyone at any time, I think is an important thing to keep in mind.
Yeah, we can't really draw this huge distinction between, you know, you have your crack addict and your cocaine addict, and then you have your alcoholic and your drug addict. We're talking about different kinds of addictions to different kinds of substances. One of the highest rates of alcoholism, also drug use, that exists amongst corporate lawyers. Alcoholism is just rampant, and I feel like that's not a matter of you know, it's maybe a matter of class, it might be a matter of money, it might be a matter of access, but we see addiction kind of spread out along the socio-ecological or sociological spectrum. Yeah.
No. Yeah, and when you have access to resources, you can maintain a level of drug use or abuse that other people can't, because they don't have that safety net of money and education and connections. You know, if you're an opiate addict and you have money, then you can be an opiate addict for a really long time. If you're an opiate addict and you don't have money, that could be a lot shorter because of the quality of drugs that you're going to have access to, the knowledge of what you're taking. And so all these are important things to keep in mind. So how did you went from, so did you start using recreationally, or did you have like some, like an injury where you had to take them, or what happened there?
I mean, it's an interesting thing. Both my parents, at one time or another, were heroin addicts. And when I was young, I did get prescribed Vicodin. I remember being 16 years old and really just absolutely loving it. I think I broke my ankle and I had a skateboard injury. Then it really actually started with probably late college, early graduate school. I kind of noticed that I was more productive. I was more productive on a kind of mixture of lots of coffee or mild amphetamines. I would just take prescription amphetamines, and then I would also take opiates. And this was just intermittent, right? It wasn't constant. And I would just, you know, be like, all right, I have a paper to do or papers to grade. Wouldn't this be a little bit more interesting on just a little bit of Adderall, a little bit of whiskey, and, you know, some prescription opiates that I would hook up from somewhere? And at the time, this is the beginning of, at the time, not a lot of people knew what Oxycontin was, but this is at a time when a lot of doctors were prescribing a lot of Oxycontin. This was like 2003, 2004. And at the same time, I was in an interesting position because I had come from like a lower income like group of people. Like I grew up around a lot of people who were essentially like, I guess you could call it like the criminal element, right? And so I knew how to score stronger opiates. And so because I was both a graduate student, but at the same time, I had this whole group of friends who knew how to smuggle drugs and knew how to score drugs and knew crooked pharmacists and stuff like that, I had a great deal of access. And at first it was actually, I just used them as kind of a performance enhancer. It eventually, probably around 24, 25, then it proceeded to like everyday use. For one thing, tramadol was just, tramadol, which is an atypical what is it called? Tramadol is not a typical opioid. It's a synthetic opioid, and it only hits certain opiate receptors, but tramadol was always available. And so I didn't even have to worry about going out to find Oxycontin or to find morphine or to find anything else. So yeah, it's probably around 24, 25 that I really started using heavily.
And tell me about how you got clean, and then like how you've maintained that recovery.
I mean, so the first time that I got clean off of opiates, and I say the first time I got clean off of opiates because eventually I ended up getting clean off of alcohol. I ended up quitting booze. But the first time I got clean off of opiates, I did go through kind of the beginning of Narcotics Anonymous. I was friends with some people in the punk rock scene. There was a guy I knew from my youth whose name was Paul Rossler. He was the keyboardist for an old LA punk rock band called the Screamers. And I called him up. I knew he was clean, and I said, I need to get clean off of drugs. And he, kind of took me under his wing. He took me to meetings, and then, we just spent a lot of time together. And that was it. I'd kicked a whole bunch of times before, and kicking at that point wasn't the huge problem. The huge problem was kind of staying clean. As I said, eventually I dropped out of graduate school. I actually dropped out of graduate school after I got clean, and this is going to be something that's probably going to be a repeating theme, is that I dropped out of graduate school because high stress situations are what lead to relapse. Essentially, an addict can't actually probably stay sober unless they learn some sort of stress management skills, right? Stress management comes before stress management skills are what addicts lack. That's what keeps you going back to drugs, right? So the point was that I dropped out of graduate school, and I moved back up here to the Bay Area. The nice thing about moving back up to the Bay Area, I was kind of away from a lot of the stressors that put me in a place where I wanted to use drugs. I haven't stuck with the Narcotics Anonymous program. I have some feelings about the scientific and the overall efficacy of 12-step programs. I think that 12-step programs are helpful in helping a lot of addicts and alcoholics stay clean, but I think that they're helpful for interesting reasons, which is it has to do with a larger social support. And I think there are other avenues of recovery. Yeah.
Certainly. I think that social support is extremely important. Dr. Carl Hart has some really interesting research on rats and cocaine, and finding that when you put a rat in a lonely, dirty cage by itself, like it will become, addicted to cocaine. But when you provide a rat with socialization and a clean, fun, engaging environment, the cocaine it's the same cocaine, but it's a lot less interesting to the rat. And I think that you can see that with humans as well. When you have other things to engage in, you're a lot less pulled to the more, self-destructive behaviors. But I want to talk about your latest. You've had a lot of career changes lately, and how did your stress management or lack thereof play into your latest relapse?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of actually the most recent relapse. Which was just a very small blip, was actually because I was taking something that I thought was an opiate, or I didn't know was an opiate, and then found out later that it had opiate properties. And by the time that I started taking it, I realized very quickly that I was actually very, very, I was addicted to it, right? And as soon as that happened, I actually made a plan with my doctor and my psychiatrist and my therapist to get off it as quickly as possible. It was initially just for pain. One of the things is that I was having a lot of difficulties with pain management. I wasn't taking a lot of the self-care opportunities that I really, really wanted to. One of the interesting things is that what I've discovered about myself anyways, is that like you have to, I have to exercise, meditate, keep a good diet, get a lot of sleep, or else I'm going to be a miserable person. And if I'm a miserable person, I'm going to find other avenues of taking care of myself, bad ones, to be really, really tempting. Which has like really great effects, because like I swear to God, my biceps never look better. And I'm looking at, but I keep on forgetting, like, I'm not doing this to look good. I'm doing this because I'm trying to keep myself sober, and I'm trying to keep myself happy, right? And the two go hand in hand.
So tell me, okay, so you need to exercise, meditate. What else?
Yeah, exercise, meditate, good diet, good rest. Actually, my therapist says this thing. She goes, look, I'm not saying that all of the problems that we're going to psychiatrists for would be solved if we did these 5 things, but I'd say about 80% of people in the United States right now currently seeking whatever type of mental health care would probably not need it if they did these 5 things. Good diet, plenty of exercise, some sort of self-care regimen, whether it be meditation or going for a walk or just smelling flowers, plenty of sleep, and a gratitude practice. 5 things, right? Being grateful for things in your life, getting plenty of sleep, doing something that calms you down or makes you happy, getting exercise, and having a good diet. If everybody did like 5 of those things, like 80% of the mental health care problems that we deal with would be gone.
And it's so interesting working in the supplement space, because, I've been reading about nootropics, and it's kind of one of those things where it's like, this is not, if you've already got those 5 things handled,
Mm-hmm.
it'll give you a little bit of a leg up, but it won't have any impact relative to those 5 things. Like any one of those 5 things is gonna have a much bigger impact than any pill or supplement you could take.
Yeah, but also the thing about it is, I can even grab some of the supplements that I take.
Please do.
What?
Please do. I'd love to know. Yeah.
Okay, one second. Your internet connection has become and by the way, this is kind of expensive, and I'll just tell you the active ingredient in it, and then you don't have to take the whole stack. But it's this right here. It's like $50 for like 100 pills, but it's been pretty helpful. But the active ingredient is I forget what the first 2 things are, but it's NALT, and it's basically L-tyrosine, right? So a lot of people take GABA, but they forget that GABA there's certain chemicals which are precursors to GABA, and L-tyrosine is one of them. I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that right. I'm not a fucking doctor, but
but you almost were.
What?
I said, but you almost were.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, bad joke.
What'd you say?
I said you almost were. It's a bad PhD joke. I'm sorry.
Oh yeah. I'm not a doctor, but I do know that one of the things that people forget is that there's certain nutritional, whatever I guess minerals, whatever they are, substances that are precursors to the creation of GABA in your neurotransmitters. Well, actually, no. Technically, GABA exists in your synaptic gaps. I actually did take a couple of semesters of neurobiology. Well, I took biology, and then I took chemistry, and then I took neurobiology. This is when I was at Berkeley. I was thinking of becoming a psychologist, oddly enough. But yeah, so GABA exists in your synaptic gaps between your neurotransmitters. It is one of the things that slows down or puts a brake on your neurotransmitters from constantly firing. Now, it turns out that what anxiety is, a lot of anxiety exists in your nervous system, and it's about, you know, your neurotransmitters constantly firing. GABA kind of puts the brakes on that. If you don't have enough GABA in your system, you're going to be a kind of jumpy, kind of anxious person. That's why one of the things they give addicts and alcoholics in recovery is gabapentin, right? But which causes, I believe, I don't think it might inhibit GABA reuptake. I don't know. We'd have to talk to somebody who's works in psychopharmacology. But I take those supplements partially because I'm trying to be less anxious, which is one of the things that stops you from relapsing. But oh yeah, I totally went on a digression. The point is, you need lots of sleep because that's when GABA is synthesized, right? And one thing we know about everybody in the working world and a lot of the people taking these nootropics, is that how you pronounce it?
I'm not sure. I should know. I've heard it a lot of different ways.
But one of the things we know about these people is they're not getting enough sleep. You need to get enough sleep for your brain to go ahead and resynthesize a lot of the neurotransmitters that you need in order to be a functional person. And so, yeah, supplements are great, but also get enough sleep, right?
Well, and anxiety is a real bitch like that because you don't get enough sleep for whatever reason, and then you lay down and then you get anxious about it, and then you lay down and you're not asleep, and you know you should be because you've got to make up for it, and you know your alarm clock's going to go off in 7 hours and then 6 hours, and then you're like, shit, and you know, an anxious mind is not primed for sleep. And so
strangely enough, yeah, I mean, I also take restful sleep. This is and I by the way, I'm not paid by these people. I'm just showing people what I take. I also take this one. I partially like this one because it kind of tastes like blackberries, and it looks a little bit like blackberries too. But yeah, so I also take this is melatonin and L-theanine. So I take melatonin, and I take it like you're supposed to, which is like an hour before you want to fall asleep. Because people often, read a couple articles on this, people take melatonin like at 3 a.m, and then they're resetting their whole bodily clock to fall asleep at 3 a.m. You take it the same time every night, an hour before you'd ideally want to fall asleep, right? And I fall asleep pretty easily. I just don't stay asleep.
Yeah, I found that supplements, especially over-the-counter supplements, like melatonin or, you know, Dream Water or whatever, they work pretty well to get me asleep, which is usually my problem, but I wake up earlier than I would either on a prescription sleep aid or unaided. Do you find that to be the case?
Yeah, I mean, I've always had what's called like something like early onset insomnia. I actually I've never had any problem falling asleep, especially because I meditate every morning, and meditation really helps you know how to get to sleep because you can calm down your mind. I just wake up at often at 3 or 4 a.m. But yeah, prescription sleep aids, man. It depends on what prescription sleep aid you're taking. Trazodone is not a bad one. But people out there taking so we just called them benzos on the street, but benzodiazepines. Benzodiazepines are brutal. And they're hell to get off of. You know, your Xanax. In the old days, it was Valium. I don't know if Seconal. So no, Seconal was barbiturate. I know I always used to get really interested in the drugs that I was taking when I was a drug addict. I'd look, especially once Wikipedia came around, knowing a little bit of chemistry and biology, I would go on Wikipedia and really research these things. But benzodiazepines are a bitch.
Yeah. And I don't find them super helpful for sleep. For me personally, I'll take a Xanax and I'll feel chilled out, but I'm not sleepy. I really like Ambien and Lunesta, but they stop working very quickly. So it's for that and health reasons, it's not a long-term solution. It's like a once a week situation.
I'll let you know, I have never blacked out as many times as I did on benzodiazepines and alcohol, which you should never, ever do, right? Never. But straight up, just like entire periods of a night would disappear, right? And, you know, man, I think I remember one time I was in a relationship and a girl was just making out with me. It was not my girlfriend. Luckily I was never really monogamous with most of my partners, but I didn't plan on that happening, right? And anyways, long story short, yeah, watch out for Xanax and booze, right?
Not a good combo.
Not a horrible combo.
Do not.
Horrible combo. Ask Roseanne Barr that one, right? Like, there's been a lot of bad tweets made because of people with taking Xanax on top of booze, right?
Ambien and booze is also a very bad idea. And this is something that I really like. I'm not a prude when it comes to drugs by any stretch of the imagination, but do not mix downers and downers. Like, don't fuck with downers. You know, be very careful with downers and do not mix them.
Don't mix downers. And the problem is mixing drugs in general is problematic. A friend of mine died when I was, and so being a drug addict, not just because the thing about drug addiction is that when you know, like upper class drug addicts, like my mom just had a Valium prescription like her entire life and just smoked weed and took Valium. She did get addicted to heroin, but most of her life she was just one of those upper middle class drug addicts. You know, you don't hear them dying as often. Now they are actually with the opiate epidemic. But you know, a lot of people that die when you're a drug addict, and a lot of people I've known have died from cocaine plus a benzo, right? So essentially, you do too much blow, you can't get to sleep, and so you take what was the Ambien or something like that, and then you just don't wake up. Heart stops. Yeah. And in two of the cases that this happened, it was the girlfriend of the person who died, who basically they just woke up next to a corpse. Yeah, it's rough.
How does that work, like, physiologically? So was it the cocaine that caused the heart problems, and then the Ambien like made them like unaware that they were having heart problems, or do you know anything more about this?
I don't actually know that much about what happens physiologically. I do know that there is a kind of feedback system that sends messages to your heart to keep beating. And one of the things about benzos is that they lower the rate of your breathing rate, which means not less oxygen is going into your bloodstream, and your pulse is your pulse is supposed to kind of slow down. But another one but cocaine is a vasodilator. I think it's a vasodilator. No, it's a vasoconstrictor. Sorry, it makes your arteries a lot smaller, right? So more blood should be pumping through. And I think at some point the feedback between the two just kind of short circuits your heart and it just stops pumping.
Mm. That's crazy. That's such a common thing to do. And I had no idea that, I mean, obviously like.
Heath Ledger, I believe, died this way.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there's a good number of people who actually die. John Belushi died from speedballing, right? There's a good number of people who die by mixing uppers and downers, right?
Mm. Very scary.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so what else should people know about addiction, and what can people who don't necessarily have substance use problems that they're aware of at least, or have acknowledged, what would you like them to know, and what can they learn from your experience?
I mean, a lot of it is summarized in this really, really great book. I believe it's called In the Realm of the Hungry Ghosts by a guy named Gabor Mate. Essentially, addiction is a kind of, the way that Gabor Mate looks at it is addiction is a kind of subset of compulsive behavior. If your cats get stressed out, they'll start licking themselves compulsively because that is a means of stress release. Like cats, when they do self-grooming, that's a means of stress reduction. Some people, as a means of stress reduction, since Amazon Prime came to be a thing, they get these little bits of stress reduction from the chemicals that are released every time they make a purchase. For some people, it's food, right? Alcohol and drugs are mostly a form of stress reduction. They're not a healthy form of stress reduction. So the trick here is to kind of look at, if you want to look to see the kinds of people who get addicted, they're highly stressed people. And if there's one thing I want to say is that it's really not alcohol and drugs are the killer, but it's stress and how we deal with stress that is the big problem here. It's a mental health crisis for sure, but it's a mental health crisis created by a group of people who feel increasingly stressed out and increasingly alienated. They can't go to family and friends for comfort or support. And because of that kind of dual problem of alienation and stress, you have a perfect mixing pot for addiction. And it really can happen. And that's why, to some extent, while some people have a genetic predisposition, which makes it more likely to happen to them, it still is the case that a lot of people are perfectly set up for an addiction just by looking at their lives and realizing I'm socially isolated and I'm stressed out. You want to avoid addiction, find ways to reduce stress, stay close to people near you, have good support networks, and take your mental health seriously.
I think that's really, really good advice. I think the social isolation is, it's a mental health emergency and it's a physical health emergency. Social isolation is empirically shown to be as bad for you as smoking cigarettes when it comes to your physical health. And it's something that is extremely stigmatized. The last thing you want if you want to be popular is to admit you're lonely. It's very stigmatized. It's very embarrassing. It's very underappreciated. People don't look around their lives and realize, like, I'm lonely and I need, either more interaction or a different kind of interaction. But I think it's true. I think a lot of us are lonely. And the way our society is set up, like from commuting by car to the single family home, to the fact that, jobs are moving away from suburbs and from, rural areas towards cities. So you've got, the people who stay where they grew up have that social support system of their families, but often don't have the economic opportunities that they need to feel fully integrated into society. And then the people who move and have the economic opportunities often have, small kind of groups of friends that are not particularly well integrated into your life. It's like if you're doing fine economically, you're making enough money, you often don't have the need, the pressing survival need that people once had to get to know your neighbors and to form those deep bonds. So how would you suggest, how have you kind of worked toward, combating loneliness in your life?
Yeah, well, we use Tinder, right? So, combating loneliness in my life. Well, I just have a pretty large, well, I try to have a large family, right? By family, I mean chosen family. Not like my biological family. My biological family is pretty sparse, right? But actually, that's the ongoing struggle. That's the ongoing struggle, especially here where I live in San Francisco. You know, everybody is so busy. It's not the kind of place where, you know, we live in these communities where we don't know our neighbors. You just try to become parts of scenes, you know, volunteer places. And most people eventually find some sort of social belonging with the people whom they work with, right? One of the difficult things is it's not necessarily alcoholic people who become, you know, people with an addiction to alcohol who become unemployed. It's often unemployed people who get an addiction to alcohol because they don't have anything to wake up for in the morning. They don't have a group of people in their lives. Yeah, that's actually, that question is a pretty, how do I do it? I actually don't know, man. One of my better friends is my yoga teacher. Seriously, I know more about his relationships than I know about the relation. And it's because I see, unlike my friends, I see my yoga teacher like once, twice a week. So I know how his love life is going. While my friends, some of them I haven't spoken to in a month, right? So maybe you find yourself a good yoga teacher. We're closer with our yoga teachers than we are with our friends in this city.
It is. It's rough. Everyone's going hard after something or several things. And so.
Yeah, we don't actually we'll take time out of our schedules to schedule yoga, but we won't take time out of our schedules to schedule our friends.
Yeah.
I mean, this is just a fact about like urban life, living in San Francisco, living in the Bay Area. You know, I haven't spoken to my friend in 3 months, but I do Pilates with the same person several times a week.
Mm-hmm. No, and it's super interesting. I think that's something that people don't appreciate enough, is that kind of random, unstructured bumping into people. It's why I think people who have kids, you know, you just see the person in the car line to pick up your kids. You see them at the PTA meeting, like you see them when you're volunteering to help your kid with this or that. And
yeah, actually, I'm thinking about either volunteering with, do you remember what the name of the place is? It's an organization that works with sex workers in
SWAP?
Might be. So I'm thinking of volunteering with them, and I'm actually thinking of starting to volunteer at a punk record store in the Mission. And the reason why is because through volunteering, you just get good social connections, right? You get connected to your community. You start seeing the same people every day. When I lived in the East Bay, I would run into people. When I lived in Berkeley, I moved to San Francisco, that stopped happening as much. You didn't just run into people the same kind of way. And I mean, in LA, it's just impossible.
Yeah, it's when I moved to SF, I immediately joined ESF, EMB, Us in My Backyard, the pro housing group. And it was incredibly useful for those kinds of, you know, to meet a lot of people who have, you know, something similar in common with, and to see them every week. And that was really wonderful. And now I'm part of a different group, and that's been, I'm still a little bit a part of EMB as well. And so the clubs are really useful. I think the volunteering is kind of the next step, where I need to figure out, okay, like, you know, what's the work I'm going to put forward. So it's not just, it's a different kind of connection when you're building and doing alongside people versus just like partying and hanging out.
Sex workers, help out sex workers. Because here's the interesting thing. I'm going to say this off the cuff, even though we're recording. If you take a look at political hypocrisy, the Democratic Party very much wants women to be able to do whatever they want with their bodies, unless it's sell it for sex, right? Or sell it. So women have the right to their bodies unless they do. So one of the things is that sex workers are not being protected by either political direction, right? That's actually, I think we talked about this once. and that's the reason, that was actually the impetus between me wanting to go and volunteer to work with sex workers, is because they're not getting protections, political protections from either political party. They are the true, unhelped group of people in not just this city, but most cities, right?
Well, and they're also, I think, when it comes to property rights and civil liberties, and this is not my argument, but they're the canaries in the coal mine. It's the sex workers that lose first, but it doesn't just, what impacts sex workers doesn't just impact sex workers. You see that with SESTA and FOSTA, they're obviously the most impacted by losing their ability to legally advertise online. But we're seeing all kinds of people get censored for all kinds of content as a result of this kind of anti-sex worker legislation.
Yeah, first it was FOSTA and SESTA, and then it was Tumblr. Right. Tumblr, yeah, right. Now all of a sudden Tumblr is very, very but, and also to get back to the topic of, drug addiction and self-care, a lot of the places where you see street prostitution is also a lot of the places where you see needle use.
Absolutely.
At least that's anecdotal a little bit, by the way, but I've lived in a couple major cities, and in Los Angeles, it's Hollywood. Here is the Tenderloin. And often that's what you see, right? And so, yeah, working with those kinds of people and being parts of those kinds of communities is an important thing. I actually think it's probably more important for addicts to be around people who are actively using, because then they get a chance to be a part of those communities. And if you're not helping people recover, then you oftentimes can forget what it's like to be in recovery, right? If you're not actively being around, because most people I know who relapse, they relapse when they're socially isolated, not when they're spending time helping other addicts, right?
Yeah, it goes back to that. Are you integrated? Or do you feel necessary? Do you feel connected? I think
I actually knew a guy who, this was amazing. He was a drug addict, heroin addict, been clean for like 10 years. He'd done the animation on Nightmare Before Christmas, and they'd sent like the entire office to Amsterdam or something like that. And he was just in his hotel room, was totally flush with cash, top of his career. And that's when he decided to start going out and using, right? And he was in Amsterdam of all places, and he knew where to find it. Yeah, it's an interesting thing. It wasn't when he was hanging out in Hollywood amongst lots of junkies. It was when he was at the top of his career that he ended up relapsing.
All the money in the world, all the success will never replace managing your stress and being connected to other humans.
Absolutely.
With that, thank you so much for coming on. This is such a intense, stigmatized topic. And so to have you come on and be open about your struggles is really admirable. And I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I really hope that what I said can help.
No doubt.
All right. Thank you, Kathy.
Thanks, Lindsay.
Thanks for tuning in to the Does It Work podcast by Biomarker Labs. For links, show notes, and more, check out biomarker.io/podcast.